Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this webinar presentation by the National Catholic Educational Association, Smarter Assessment, How to Assess for Careers That Don't Exist Yet. I'm Andrea Cobb, Assistant Director of Professional Development with NCEA, and I'm happy to be your moderator and your host this evening. Just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. Please note that your microphone connections have been muted. If you have questions or comments during today's presentation, just send those through the chat box that appears in your GoToWebinar control panel. If you want to ask a question or leave a comment, just use your mouse to click into the blank box area, type your question using your keyboard, and then click send. The webinar presentation will last about an hour, and there will be opportunities for questions and answers. You can post questions or comments for the presenter at any time. Immediately following the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief survey, and we thank you in advance for providing us with this valuable feedback. Within 24 hours, I will be emailing you your certificate of attendance as well as the webinar recording and a copy of all the presentation materials. You can also download the slides from the handout section of your GoToWebinar control panel at any time. Let us begin as we do all things in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. It's now my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening, Tom Mock. Tom is a history teacher and an Assistant Director of Education Technology at Archbishop Spalding High School in the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Welcome, Tom. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks a lot for having me, Andrea, and thanks to all of you for joining. As Andrea said, my name is Tom Mock. I've been teaching at Spalding for about 9 years now. My primary focus in the classroom right now is AP US history. So a lot of what I talk about tonight is going to be history oriented, but I'm going to try to touch on other subjects as well. And I'm under my first year of working in the education technology department, so I'm looking forward to kind of taking new roads and seeing how things go from there. So the topic of my presentation tonight, how to assess for careers that don't exist yet, that line probably sounds familiar to anybody that's been in an education course over the last 20 or so years, if not longer. And it's based on this quote that's on your screen here. We are currently preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that haven't yet been invented in order to solve problems we don't even know are problems yet. And as near as I can tell, the first person to say this was Richard Riley, Clinton's Secretary of Education under Clinton, but it's become so ubiquitous now that if you just do some Google searching, dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that there's plenty of others that are now laying claim to what Riley is believed to have first said. And whenever we talk about this, we usually talk about it in terms of pedagogy. And we say that when we're teaching students, they need to be introduced to complex problem solving, critical thinking. There's an emphasis on collaboration. So what happens in your classroom tends to be extremely hands-on, extremely involved for the students as they kind of explore things on their own. But then if you look at the majority of assessment that's happening, it is, especially in the more standardized test realm, it is very heavily reliant on multiple choice. And in preparing for this presentation, I did some digging into where multiple choice started, because historically, back through the even through the Industrial Revolution, testing tended to be verbal. A teacher would ask a student a question, the student would give that back. But as the 1900s, as we moved into World War I, we tended to want more data collection. So it's kind of disputed where multiple choice starts, but one of the stories I found was that it was actually the U.S. military would use multiple choice as a means of collecting data on new recruits to figure out the best path to send them on. It turns out that multiple choice testing actually didn't do much for them. They actually said that it was useless, the data was not helpful, but it was still kind of packaged and relayed to educators as this means of having an easy way to collect data about students and to compare them. So that's one form of testing that's very, very prevalent today. You'll also notice essay and short answer questions, but even those, when we give that to a student in your traditional assessment, you think about it on a test, and it's very reliant on their recall. They have to have memorization as a part of their study strategy in order to pass these sort of tests. Now, as an end around for that, to make students more reliant on skills, we've come up with these ideas of project-based learning, research-based learning, your research papers, research projects, those sorts of things, which are fantastic tools of assessment. The problem is when most educators give that style of assessment, it tends to come with this famous list of don'ts. Wikipedia is immediately listed as something like you immediately tell the students, don't go to Wikipedia, you're going to get bad information there. Even though for a lot of teachers, I know for myself, it's a little hypocritical because when I'm looking something up, I tend to go to Wikipedia. Granted, I have a background knowledge that can help to verify whether or not that information is true, but it's still something that the vast majority of adults turn to for information, but we're telling students don't do it. Don't rely on .coms. Watch out for Yahoo Answers and Ask. Not that those are ever truly reliable sources, but we're telling students just don't use this. Spark Notes is another big one that we're telling students to always avoid. So we have these students that, while they have these projects and processes where they have to do research, they're not venturing away from the parameters that we give them. And the reason why I think this matters is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2016 election here. I know everybody's tired of hearing about it. I'll try not to go super in depth on it, but fake news was and still is a huge story. And we're talking about a generation of adults, especially those that went through school with 2001 with No Child Left Behind. And I know with my experience in schools, we were doing standardized testing back when I was a student before No Child Left Behind. But this emphasis on this style of memorization and test and these lists of don'ts, now we have students that are becoming adults who get these sources that we told them to steer away from, and they don't really have the tools to figure out what is real and what isn't, because we've steered them away so much from the what is real, from the fake websites or the less reliable websites, that they just haven't been exposed to them in any kind of formal assessment setting. So that was one reason why I got onto this topic. Another reason involves a reporter from the Washington Post. His name is David Fahrenthold, and he this past year won the Pulitzer Prize in National Reporting for his story about Donald Trump and his philanthropy. So the story here goes, if you remember back to the Republican debates, at the beginning of 2016, there was one where Donald Trump said that he was not going to participate in the debate because he said he didn't feel as though he was being treated fairly. So instead he held a rally, charged admission for it, and said that any revenue raised at this rally there would be a donation made to a veterans organization, which sounds simple enough. And David Fahrenthold's editors went to him shortly after that rally and said, can you find out where that money went? Donald Trump had claimed to have given $1 million. So Mr. Fahrenthold called Corey Lewandowski, who at that point was Trump's campaign manager, and he asked him, where did this money go? And Lewandowski said, you don't need to worry about it. It's been given. And then he kind of dodged the question. So Fahrenthold spent the next couple of days trying to research and find out where this money went. And he was having no luck. He was, trying various people on Trump's team, calling various charities. So he decided, you know what, this isn't working, and he turned to Twitter. And what he did was he would tweet at various veterans organizations, and he would tag Donald Trump's Twitter handle in it. Well, after one day of poking around, that night he got a phone call from Donald Trump And in that phone call, Trump promised that he was going to give $1 million, and then he named the organization where it was going to go. So from that, Farenthold found out that Trump actually hadn't, when he talked to Lewandowski, his campaign manager, he hadn't actually given that money away yet, and it wasn't until he started poking around that the contribution was made. So from that story, his editor said, well, he's been claiming that during his time in public life, Donald Trump that is, that he's been giving away money to charity quite frequently. Can you find out about any of those charitable contributions? So this time, he again tried to go through Trump's team. He again got stonewalled, so he turned to Twitter. And on Twitter, he just put out there, hey, I'm trying to find any group that Donald Trump may have made a charitable donation to. And he just asked his followers, see if you can find it. And I love his approach here. You can see the two pictures on the left and the right where he's using this very new technology, but he's still posting pictures of his old school notebook that he's using in this research. And he crowdsourced an entire article through Twitter. He would make sure that he verified any lead that he received, the biggest one being a story of at one event, he found out that the Trump Foundation gave $10,000 at the event in a silent auction. And it turned out that what he bought was a portrait of Donald Trump. So David Farenthold tried to find this portrait, and he ended up putting it out again to his Twitter followers, and this gentleman here, Enrique Acevedo, actually tweeted back at it, and he found it in the Champions Lounge of one of Trump's hotels. So from this lead on Twitter, this reporter was able to verify exactly where this painting had gone and was able to track down the full story of this charitable donation. Through his research, he wasn't able to find a whole lot of other donations, but he did write a story, and the story is linked at the end of this PowerPoint, about Trump's charitable giving. And I went back and forth with him over the last couple of weeks, and I asked him, did you have at some point in your life a teacher or some sort of class in journalism school? And then he told me he had one journalism class in high school to learn how to become a reporter, and now he's won a Pulitzer. And he said, I didn't really find that I had any training in it, and he gave me this quote. So, quote, "Long story short, I blundered into this tactic through desperation, often one of the great causes of innovation in journalism," end quote. So from this, he actually published an entire story about how he did his research. But now that this guy has won a Pulitzer, other reporters are copying this method, and they call it the Farenthold method. So whenever they find that they are having no luck in researching a story, they turn to their Twitter followers and hope that through either retweets or a direct follower, they can get a lead on a story to get information. And all of this caused me to ask myself, the traditional assessments that we see, are they creating David Farentholds? Are they creating somebody who's innovative enough and unafraid enough to try methods of research that are non-traditional, that are not taught? So I started by asking teachers, both coworkers at Spalding and friends that I've met through, I'm in an AP US History Facebook group, so I just put this out there, like, what is the purpose of assessment? And I got great responses. Assessment is at the heart of everything we do as teachers. We are constantly doing it to check and see if the kids get what we are saying. Assessment, in its different forms and approaches, is to determine one's understanding or mastery of a concept or topic. And these are great answers, and it's absolutely 100% why we assess in schools. But I pressed a little bit further and I said, okay, you're getting understanding on the topic, but what else are you trying to do by making students take these tests? And one of the answers I got from one of these teachers that I really love is, I think I'd say my classroom is about skill over content, but that sometimes assessment has to be content focused because you have to prove what these kids know about the topic you just taught. And then he went on to say, and the best assessments, like the best classrooms, they find a way to do both. So this led me to ask, and I've tried to do this in my classroom this year, how do we create these assessments that do both, that measure skill and measure content knowledge? And I've come up with just a couple of approaches, a couple of techniques that you can use to do this. And the first, I know I was kind of ragging on multiple choice in the beginning, is your traditional multiple choice question. But you've got to be careful with how you write them, especially we're in a, it's 2017. A lot of us are going BYOD. We're doing online testing. And your traditional multiple choice question was something that looked like this, and I eliminated the C and D just to make it a little bit easier to read on the PowerPoint. But this question here, which of the following represented the largest post-World War II effort to bolster the economies of non-communist nations? With this one, you're just asking them to look something up. You're not asking them to think about anything. You're just straight, here's a question, what's the answer? So, if, for instance, a student was in some sort of job in their future, they would just Google this. And anybody else in the world would simply Google this and find the answer. So this is a multiple choice question that, yeah, it checks to see their content knowledge, but at the end, it's just rote memorization and recitation of fact. But if you ask a question that actually asks them to go a little bit deeper into their understanding, it could come out something like this: which pairing below best fits the pattern of Cold War confrontation followed by Cold War coexistence? With this one, it requires a deeper level of knowledge. It requires them to know what NATO is, what the Truman Doctrine is, what the Marshall Plan is, what the SALT Treaty is. And from there, they build the answer. This is a style of question that you could give on any test, be it open note, closed note. I like to use these style of questions on, I call them open internet exams or open everything exams. And the kids always get all excited when I give them. They're like, oh, this is going to be easy. I don't have to worry about anything. And then after the first one, they're like, whoa, wait a minute, this was way harder than I was expecting, because it's not an exercise in just looking up information. They have to both look up information, synthesize it, and then come up with a response. So there's a lot more involved in this style of multiple choice question. Another style of question that I like, and if you're familiar with the AP histories, they've moved in this direction more and more in recent years with the test redesigns, is a stimulus-based multiple choice. With these, you're relying on the student reading and interpreting a primary or a secondary source document and then going ahead and answering the question. So to do that, they have to examine the source, synthesize the information not only in the source, but the information that they come to the table with, and then they have to answer the question. It's not a matter of just reading like the first multiple choice question I showed you. Here's a question, here's a vocabulary term that goes along with it. It's a matter of reading it, figuring out what it means, and then going forward with coming up with an answer. So an example of one of these questions is this, and this is pulled off of an AP US History prep book that I have. Where the student is required to read over the entire stimulus and then answer the question. So I know it's a little backwards on the PowerPoint, so you actually want to read what's on the right and then the question is on the left. So I'm just going to give you a second to look over this, and then I'll come back and talk about it in just a little bit here. All right, so when a student unpacks this question, it's much more involved than your traditional multiple choice question. And one of the tricks they have to learn, and this helps them in discerning between a good source and a bad source, they have to start with that citation at the end. So I always tell my students, read the citation first. So in this instance, you have Senator Joseph McCarthy as your source. So a student has to know McCarthy. They have to know the background of McCarthyism. Um, they have to have the idea of the time period and everything that McCarthy did and stood for before they read this source. Then they've got to read the source and relate it to the question that's being asked during the 1950s, which the following resulted in the sentiments expressed in the excerpt above. So from this, you have to read that, you have to get a main idea, you have to know who McCarthy is, you have to do all that before you can even begin to answer this question. So again, this is a question that you could provide now in an AP environment because the test they have in May is closed note. They wouldn't be allowed to have any sort of research to go along with this. But with how well written the question is, they would be able to, make this, you could make this an open note test, open internet test, and it's not like they can just look at the question and quickly gather the answer. They have to become proficient in gathering data in order to answer the question, and then especially if you put time constraints on the test, then they have to learn how to do it quickly to come back and to give an answer. And click the wrong button there. I know not everyone listening to this is a social studies teacher, so you're probably asking, well, what about content area? So I've talked to a couple of other content area teachers about this. My wife teaches geometry, and she said that one thing she uses, she's gone away from the students necessarily having to memorize a formula or memorize different facts. Instead, she'll give them the formulas. So for her geometry test, sometimes she'll provide them the basic proofs that are in the textbook, but then she will ask a question that makes them synthesize multiple levels of those proofs, and that more simulates a real-world scenario that these kids will run into in the future. If you're an accountant, my mother was an accountant, and back when she first started, she had to memorize all these different laws, all these different statutes in order to do her job efficiently. She doesn't have to do that anymore. Now she just has to know, okay, where can I find the information I need in order to deal with this situation that I have at work? This method is mirroring that. They have the information. They know where to look for it. In this case, it's on the particular test, but you could just say, here's your geometry textbook, here's a couple of questions, figure it out. And they have to know where in their textbook to find that information. Same could go with chemistry, physics, basic math classes. Provide those formulas and then give them a task. We know how much they hate word problems, but really that is what they're going to deal with in the real world. So maybe take away some of that anxiety of that word problem, give them the formula so they can say, okay, here's the formula, I have to use it in this manner in order to get to my answer. In engineering, in my opinion, engineering is should be the proving ground for this style of just kind of open source testing. Look up the basic building blocks or provide them with basic building blocks in order to solve a problem. Give them just the small tools that they can use to solve whatever problem you're putting in front of them. In language arts or even social studies or courses that require a lot more writing, give them the essay topic in advance. Let them come with a note card that has a couple of ideas on it. You don't have to give them the questions, but provide them with some sort of topic so they're not walking into it blind. I know as an AP teacher or speaking to teachers in public schools that may have an end of course exam, the worst thing for a student and for a teacher of that student is for them to walk in and be caught totally off guard by a question. So why not take away that anxiety, and then you can test what they actually know. You can test the skill instead of simply what they've memorized. I'm not saying there's not a place for memorization in this. Hopefully in what you've been doing through the inquiry-based pedagogy that you've been engaged in is making them access information to the degree that they actually do start internalizing it. But at the end of the day, aren't we more interested in seeing them understand a concept than we are seeing them straight just kind of regurgitate what you've been giving them over the last couple of weeks? And you know, this is something that that hopefully we start young, you know, with the, if you're an elementary teacher, promote that inquiry over answer. You know, we at this point have standardized elementary to a large degree. You know, let them explore a little bit, and I like to say, let them get dirty. You know, this is my 3-year-old eating her birthday cake, and think about the way that you learn to do things when you're young. You know, my daughter here, Mary, she won't be eating like this at 15. But if I was simply spoon feeding her, you know, she would probably be a heck of a lot cleaner. It would make for a far less cute picture. But she's not going to learn anything if I just kind of give her the information. So let them explore. Let them celebrate the journey in it, not the end result so much. You know, celebrate the trying, not so much the answer that they come up with in the end. So what does it take to do this? You have to rely on it. I know it's become a little bit of an education cliche in the last couple of years, but the growth mindset is huge here, and it's the idea that they're allowed to fail. Let them go out and use those bad websites. Let them make mistakes on an assessment, be it a research project or a test. But when they make those mistakes, maybe don't make it so punitive. Let them do something to correct it. Do something to lessen that end result, that grade that tends to have the impact that makes students a little bit more afraid to take a risk. In this way, they'll learn to use those more reliable websites on their own. You won't have to give them the parameters. I love in my class, whenever I give an assignment, if they ask me a question even during lecture and we're a BYOD school, I'll tell them even if I know the answer, I don't know, why don't you look that up? Why don't you tell me? If they ask me, you know, well, where do I look to find this? You know, they have Google at their fingertips. They have to start there. They've got to learn how to build this inquiry on their own. But I try to lessen the impact of the grades on both assessment and class projects when they do take those risks. And also with the growth mindset idea, don't give them easy solutions. A friend of mine in Boston, she had a teacher, and it was a math teacher, and he would write a solution. They would walk in the class, there would be a solution on the board. So naturally, they all just start furiously scribbling down this solution, you know, not thinking about it, just straight transcribing it. And he would say to him, how do you know I gave you the right answer? Why are you trusting me? And when we talk about building these students who are able to discern the information around them, they've got to figure out who and what they can trust, but they also have to verify. They have to learn to go back and verify that what they're doing is actually right and is going to lead them to the right solution. And the tricky part of this for most teachers, I know it was for me, is that you've got to give up some control to do it. You've got to let them run free. They might get into trouble a little bit with it, and you've got to talk to them about, you know, learning from that. But the big thing is they have to be let free. You got to let them off the leash a little bit for them to learn from them. And in the end result, the hope of this is that they start taking ownership of their own learning. I've begun the practice of the day after a test. What I used to do was simply I would stand up in front of the class and we would go over the multiple choice, and I would say, okay, anybody with a question on 1 through 10? let me know, and we'll talk our way through it. Well, now what I do is I hand those tests back, and I say, talk to each other, and you need to find for me one story from someone who they got it right, you got it wrong, and you need to be able to explain to me their thought process in getting it right and what your thought process was in getting it wrong. They have to learn to understand why they get things wrong in order to become better students and in order to move forward and be more successful with this stuff. Now, of course, there's a lot of drawbacks with this. You know, students do have to have grades that are punitive at times. Otherwise, there's no consequence for some of their actions. So I'm not saying to do this with every assessment, but maybe once a quarter, throw this in there as something different. It's a new learning opportunity. It's a new way for them to prove what they know and to learn from it. And also, this is extraordinarily time-consuming. To develop these stimulus-based multiple choice questions, for example, when I went to AP training at the College Board, they said it takes them 24 hours to write one of these questions. No one has 24 hours to write one test question. That's just not real life. So what I would encourage you to do is, you know, maybe adapt questions you already have, where you can throw a stimulus on top of it, or just make a question you have, you know, require a higher level of thinking skill. Work in teams. One of the things that we've started doing at Spalding is the teachers of different content areas will start sharing their test questions. We usually do this through Google Drive, or now Google Team Drive. And what it ends up doing is you get to see what people are doing in other classrooms, but it also takes away that burden of you having to write entire tests on your own. Obviously, you have to coordinate testing dates a little bit for this to happen, so kids aren't just passing the information around. But it allows you to kind of crowdsource the questions on your own. It saves you time, and it increases interaction between you and department members. Another thing you can do with this, because a lot of this style of question lends itself to essays or other open-ended style of questions, use websites like puregrade.io. Take the grading off of you and put it onto them. You have to develop a good rubric for them to do it, but a site like puregrade.io allows you to upload answers anonymously, so students don't know whose test they're grading or whose essay they're grading, and use it as a way for them to see what other students are doing that works or doesn't work, but it also lets them get in your head and kind of see the process from a different level. And, you know, lastly on this, if there's any administrators that are out there listening, think about giving your teachers time to do this. Get creative with it. Maybe, you know, provide subs for a class period or two every couple of weeks, so they can get together and maybe come up with good assessment activities that allow for students to be more involved, to allow them to go out there and research a little bit more and come up with answers on their own, and not just give you what they've memorized over the course of a couple weeks. And hopefully that'll create students that at the end, we all want our students to simply be better students, prepare them for that next year, that next course, and for their life beyond education. So at this point, thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions now, feel free to ask them in the chat. Andrea, did you see anything yet, or did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, we have a few questions, and if you're listening and you have questions, you can continue to put them in the chat. Can you talk about how you differentiate assessment in your classroom for different learners?
Okay, certainly. It's the level of scaffolding that you provide for them at the end of the day. You know, for I've done this approach in college prep courses all the way through AP courses. For the college prep, obviously, there's a lot more hand-holding in the beginning. You do have to give them an idea of the websites that they have to use. So maybe you start off just looking, you give them a question and you just say, okay, how would you go about answering this. And then you talk about the sources that they used in order to answer the questions, and you start evaluating the sources with them. Obviously, for them too, you're going to give them fewer questions so they have more time to synthesize each question. On an AP level, the failure aspect is the part that's really hard for them. I found that CP students actually respond really well to this kind of self-assessment, figuring out where they went wrong and where they can go right in the future. But for an AP student, that can be really crushing. They're used to just getting it right. They're used to just knowing it. So you almost play the role of psychiatrist with them for a little bit, where you talk them through the whole process of like, no, this is how you learn. This is how you build up the ability to perform the way you're used to performing. So it's about varying the number of questions that they have. It's about the level of support that you give them, and really the end product that you're looking for. Like I said, with the CP course, in the beginning, that product you're looking for might just be, give me a list of websites that you would use to answer this question. And then you slowly add in more steps from there.
Thank you. You mentioned the open book, open note, open everything exams, I think is the term you used. How do you balance that with, you know, your traditional tests and the kind of prep that you have to do for the AP exam?
I certainly do both. My students deal with both. Mine actually dread the open note quizzes now and prefer the traditional ones that they're going to get on the AP test, just because they know the level of thought that goes into the open ones. It actually ends up being a little trickier than the multiple choice questions. But you have to do both. I mean, at the end of the day, these kids are still going to have to take the SATs, the LSATs, the GREs later on down the road. So you have to allow them to do both. So what I do is, again, I vary the assessments. Some of them, I decide this one's going to be your open everything style. Others are going to be your more traditional closed. But I think it's important to expose them to both, because at the end of the day, these barrier tests that they have to take to get into college, get into grad school, they do require that closed note. But once they're in college or once they're into a career, they need to learn how to navigate the other style of question.
Very true. We had another question come through regarding Wikipedia. This person says that they also use Wikipedia as a go-to. Do you have any tips for teaching students how to be wise readers of Wikipedia, that sometimes false information is inserted, or that the moderators sometimes bring biases to what they allow?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things about Wikipedia, actually. The person that was my mentor teacher when I student taught, he gave an assignment once on the 1860 election. And he went on, before he gave the assignment, he edited Wikipedia to talk about the television campaign that Lincoln ran that was extremely effective, but there were a lot of negative advertisements involved. And then he watched as 5 or 6 students turned in papers talking about the television campaign between the two. So I always tell my students that story. And I also tell them, Stephen Colbert famously with African elephants edited, he encouraged his viewers to go on when he was on Comedy Central and edit the page that said that, not only are the elephants no longer going extinct, but they're starting to rally the troops so they can now go forth and take over the world and eliminate all of humanity. So I always give them cautionary tales about Wikipedia, but I also tell them that source section at the bottom of the page is a gold mine. If you can direct them, and this is where stimulus-based multiple choice, this is where that comes in, where they pay attention to the citation. I tell them every claim that's made on that site, if it's not sourced, ignore it. But if it is sourced, click on the number next to whatever assertion they made so you can see what that was. Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help them the most. I mean, there are millions of fake Wikipedia entries out there, given, Ohio State a couple weeks ago, they were made fun of for losing, I think it was to Oklahoma. I don't follow college football all that closely, but somebody just went on and said that, that Oklahoma's home stadium was Ohio State Stadium. So I definitely tell them to look out for that, and teaching point of view is big on that too, in identifying bias.
Very good. Do you ever get pushback either from parents or from colleagues or administration, when trying to design these sort of alternate assessments or something that can seem subjective?
Um, Usually it's actually from other teachers who are, you've been doing something that way for a long time. That's why I put the picture of my daughter in there because, if you were angry, take pity on me, see something cute and lessen your anger. But yeah, I get a lot of pushback in this. And really what's helped, my AP scores have been pretty good over the last couple of years. Last year was a learning experience. My scores went down, and I had to scale back on some of the open aspect and make some of the traditional assessments count for a little bit more. So yeah, you just like I talked about growth mindset with students, you need it yourself. My administration's actually been pretty supportive of it. We've talked a lot. I have a colleague that talks a lot about like trying to get rid of grading, which obviously we're never going to be actually able to do. But they're supportive of it. They just say, make sure that you're still preparing them for, like I said, those barrier tests to get into schools and the AP exam at the end of the year. Um, parents, it's funny because when I give my first open note quizzes at the beginning of the year, they students don't do well on them. So back to school night is occasionally a pitchforks and torches situation. They walk in ready to rumble about it, but I talk to them about how the students, it's a learning experience. They build through the year, and usually both students and parents at the end of the year have told me like, I'm really glad we did those. It helped me to make sure that I was getting the right information. So you will get early pushback, but as long as you're doing it effectively, and I have conversations with the students about it constantly just to check in and make sure they're doing okay with it. As long as you do that, in the end, things usually work out, and students usually cite it as something that really helped them in preparation for the AP exam.
Great. Well, that seems to be all the questions that have come through the chat for today. Did you have any final words for our audience before we conclude?
Yeah, first off, thank you very much for the time. I know that there's probably a lot of other things you'd rather be doing at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday in the middle of the week. But thank you very much for listening. I hope you learned something. If you have any feedback or any further questions, please feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter. And if you want to do further reading about the articles that spurred this whole idea of mine on, they're linked in the last slide here, both the story that won him the Pulitzer and then the story that told the way that he did all of this background research. So thank you very much, and thank you, Andrea, for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Tom, for sharing all this with us, and thanks to our audience for their participation and their questions. I want to remind everyone that I will email you within 24 hours with this presentation as well as your certificate of attendance and the link for the on-demand recording, which you're free to share or view yourself again. I want to thank you all and ask you to please visit ncea.org for upcoming webinars as well as our professional development events. And may you enjoy a blessed evening.